kind of intimidating standing up the front, especially I've seen so many good sessions. You think, oh damn, you know, they've heard all my jokes, they're not going to laugh at my cartoons, which seemed very good at 3 in the morning when I put the presentation together, but in the light of day, completely different. My name's Andy Thornton, and I work for Media Current. And today we're going to talk about security, locking your website down. One of the things I wanted to do though is instead of kind of slamming lots of code at you, I really wanted to break it down into a little bit of technology up front, things to watch out for, common attacks, get you familiar with some of the things to keep in mind when you're trying to lock a website down, but also spend a lot of time, which is more of the people side, and that's actually how to handle a security breach, what to do, and to give you some different ideas of things to watch out for, different gotchas I've had to deal with over the years as a result of not knowing. So some of these things hopefully will make things a bit easier. So I thought we'd start off with looking at some of the common security issues, and first one is SQL injection. Has anyone heard of SQL injection? Has anyone had SQL injection done against them? Oh, okay. SQL injection is kind of a sneaky trick. Basically, any form that you have inside your website sends data back to Drupal in some fashion. So there's always something behind it that takes that data and does something with it. We always assume that the information being sent from the form is something that's safe, but that's not always the case. So, and this is a very simplistic view of what a SQL injection attack can look like. Simple thing, if we want to do a query and say, show me all the users where their username is equal to whatever the person put in the box on my website. We're assuming they're going to type in something safe, like Dave. But they could, if you look at the bottom, put another query in there, which basically gets stuck on at the end of the SQL query. And if the programmer who put the forms together isn't checking for that, he can basically end up having his query run their query on top of it. And if you think about a statement like an OR statement, I could say, show me everything from users where name equals Andy, or their user ID is equal to 1. And what's Drupal user 1? Admin, which would be bad. So that's a very simplistic view of what injection is. An easy way of describing it is this. Well, I thought it was funny. So anything that can be put into a form can be passed down to your database. So you need to make sure that when you're working with your database, you lock it down. I love that one. So some things that we can do with Drupal. Drupal's actually really good for providing ways to protect your code. And one of the most common ways is we've got a number of functions that we can use. You never take the input straight from the user. You always wrap it in a function that allows you to basically dumb it down to its lowest common denominator, plain text. If people insert code into a function, if it's pushed down to text, it's not going to. It's going to strip out any of the characters which are going to be, problematic for your code. So in this example, we just took a value from a field, but we're wrapping it in check plain, and check plain will basically strip out any code that potentially you have in that input. Check markup allows us, and also filter XSS, allows us to actually specify some tags are allowed. So sometimes with your posts, you want your users to have the ability to do bold, italic, underline, but you don't necessarily want them to use things like script or embed or object. So you can actually specify those specific options inside your code. Don't just look at these for form entries. You also need to look at these in any way that you pass information to your database. So I've seen sites where it's really wonderful what they've done on the forms. They've locked them down, and then they have it so they take a parameter on a command line. How many times have you gone to a website where you want to look up a record from a database, and you often see on the URL, ID equals 3, or 5, or 6. So it's passing a number down to the database. And the database programmer's got it saying, select something from this database where this number equals this. That's an input. It may not be a form entry, but it's still something we need to lock down. So as well as forms, we should also track anything where data is passed to the database needs to be locked down. Now, the other one is when you take that data, you want to trap it and clean it up, but also when you run queries, you want to make sure that your queries are not running anything other than the query that you want to run. So if I want to do a simple statement that does a select from the database, I don't necessarily want to input a parameter to it until I know exactly what it is. So Drupal actually gives you the ability, when you're actually running a query, to pass your parameters as pass your input as a parameter. So if you look at the first one, the user has actually hard-coded his parameter directly into his string and executed it as SQL. On the second one, you have the same approach, but at the very end, we've actually got it where it's being passed as a parameter to DB query. Drupal will protect you at that point. It will actually do all its checks for SQL injection. So if you do things the Drupal way, you're good to go. I can see so many people just sitting there going, "Are you going to do this all the way?" It's a lot of code. I don't code. That's the other half. It's going to be a little bit code up front, and I apologize. Cross-site scripting. I had a lot of fun with this recently because I was trying to find some examples of what is cross-site scripting and how does it work and what can it do to me in Drupal. Is everyone familiar with the input filters? When you actually do a post, you can sit there and say whether it's filtered HTML or full HTML. Just as a test, I put a little Drupal site locally and I set the comment field to full HTML, and then I pasted the following code into that field. And when I went to view the comment, it did that. Basically, what happened, we'll go back, it executed that as JavaScript. It inserted JavaScript into my field, and when I viewed it, it ran the JavaScript. And this example was very minor, just popped a little input box on the screen. There are some really malicious ones out there, which I have to admire, I have to be honest. They're so clever, but we don't want them to happen on our sites, but they're very well put together. I was looking at a couple of demos, and one of the demos was this chap pasted some code into a comment, saved it, nothing happened. When the administrator came along and logged in as admin, he's got elevated privileges. So he then went to the approval queue and went to look at the comment. And of course, the moment he viewed the comment, it logged him out. And not only did it log him out, it changed the title of his website. And it changed his password. So basically, because he looked at the comment on an account with elevated privileges, he was screwed. It was like completely locked out of his own website. So I tried this as a test, and the problem is that as developers, you often code and try and play whack-a-mole. How many ways can someone break into my website? And you're always trying to figure out a way they could break in and try and get around it. Sorry, Mark.
Actually, I was advised, and I never took the advice, that you really should not use this one particular. Just have another admin that has all the code.
It's a good idea, but how many people do that? That's the other thing. Well, and you've had issues as well, even though you don't use that. No. Okay. Yeah, this is disastrous. When I was trying this on my local machine, I was shocked at some of the things we were capable of doing. But the one thing that was interesting about this, and it's a bit of a kind of a geeky thing, as a programmer, you often try and look at a piece of code or a problem, try and figure out a way of stopping people from breaking your code. So I would try and think about all the different ways someone could do it. I would never consider a string like this as being something that's inserted. It's very hard to predict that somebody could try and do this in order to break your code. So one of the techniques when you're building your own modules and your own code is always code for what you know and what you expect. If I know that I'm going to get a name, a username coming in, then I'll look for just names. I'll ignore every other character that is potentially not in a name. So go back to that cartoon where they talked about Bobby Tables, semicolon, delete star from. There's no one, you're never going to have a name of somebody called Bobby Tables, semicolon, delete star from users. So it's better to code for what you expect. If you're looking at trying to pull a node out from the database, you know it's going to be a number. So wrap it in an int function just to force it to be a number. And then if anyone does try and pass anything additional, it just gets trashed. So cross-site scripting. There are some amazing websites out there with lists of scripts that you can try. Do not try them on your website. Try them on a local test environment and be amazed. Sorry. Yes, it is. It's always clean. It's when the users go in and you start to change your settings. You'll find that full HTML is not turned on by default. When you go into a default site, it's always filtered HTML. And those functions I showed you earlier with check plain, and those are basically what happens is any input that goes in from there gets passed to those functions and they scrub the input out. So anything that goes into your system and anything that comes out of it has to be really scrubbed. And when we put it into a comment field, we want to block it going into the database, but we also want to block it coming out as well. Drupal does that by default. But you go in and start laxing permissions and changing stuff to full HTML, you open yourself up to these kind of attacks. Now the problem is you want to keep full HTML, so maybe you'll assign that role to a specific trusted user group. So if it's a new forum, I'll say, if you post anonymously, you get check plain, plain input. But if you're a trusted user or an admin, then you can have full HTML or filtered HTML as an option. Yeah. It's one of the reasons I switched to Drupal was because of this feature, is because, as you said, the community maintains the code. So you tend to find that Drupal itself is very secure. But when you're writing your own code, I often find that it's playing whack-a-mole. You basically put your site up as all secure, and then somebody discovers a weird feature in PHP or Apache or even your database environment, and they still break in. And then you're playing that catch-up, trying to close that hole, and then another one opens up. With Drupal, it's actually very secure out of the box. So.
Modern Drupal scrubbing even full HTML is, if there's truly just HTML, it's not where you use there's JavaScript. Why not just a modern scrub or something?
If you do filtered HTML, it won't allow the script tags. It has a very limited. No, they do, unfortunately. No. Yeah. Yeah. It's but the thing is, you've got functions built in that if you're running your own code, as long as you make sure that it's primary rule of thumb: never trust a user. Never. Even you really don't know what they're going to input into the system. So it's always better to take the side of actually make it as restricted as possible.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't think that by default, who's going to leave a comment or who's going to post a blog post or whatever? What are they going to put in the script? They're not.
No, they're not.
So they just say, okay, never any scripts.
Well, the one time I found it's good for full HTML is if you're assigning it to a role, like a site editor's role, that you may want more HTML markup than is given to you as part of the filtered set. So say you want to embed an iframe, or you want to put something in there that's not necessarily part of the standard markup, you kind of need more of that list of tags that you'd use, in which case you'd use full HTML. But you wouldn't assign that to anonymous users on a comment, or people filling out a web form. So you're only really going to use that for trusted users. But the default setting is filtered HTML, which is very secure. Yeah, it's a fact of life. You got a website out there, people will try and break it, or they'll try and break it. Yeah.
I edited that code and tried this and it works. Right there. So I don't think you want to build that kind of stuff out.
You're good at skill. It's not what I'm talking about. It's saying that it seems like it would make sense. Just by default, only show HTML to JavaScript.
Well, it does. In default, it's filtered HTML. You have to go in and make that conscious choice to open it up to full HTML. And unfortunately, a lot of people do. And if you do that, it opens you up to these kind of attacks. Yeah.
What does Drupal work do if somebody wants to post an SQL?
Well, that's not going to execute on the browser. It's only going to be any kind of scripting language that runs in the browser is open to that kind of vulnerability. If they're posting PHP, 9 times out of 10, if they're using the full HTML or the filtered, it's going to render it as HTML. It's not going to execute it as PHP. There is a PHP filter, but we'd never let our users use that. That's really more for the people who own the site, the developers. Anyway, let's go on and take a look at some of the others. Yeah, so that's what happened. In this instance, it actually popped a box up and actually printed a nice little message on screen. There are other occurrences where you can get it where, as I said, if you've got an elevated position, now that elevated role, JavaScript can execute anything in the form of an AJAX call. So it could basically execute a command from the admin panel, and a general user will never have that level of access, but as an admin user, we do. So your JavaScript could do something very malicious to your website. Don't try these on your site. I tried these on one of mine, and it was very entertaining. They do the same thing, but to give you an idea of how bad it can get, you've usually got a limitation on how many characters you can put into a form, and if you want to do a script, do anything fun or not so fun, you often put it on a remote website as a way of delivering the script or delivering a payload. So on the various examples on the top, we've got examples where we're using non-standard characters. They get rendered in the browser, and a lot of these can be exploiting bugs in the browser. For instance, on some of these didn't run for me on Chrome. Chrome just couldn't read some of the characters, but Firefox they did. So on some sites they were fine, but on some browsers they exploit the bug in the browser in order to execute the code. Calling remote files is horrid. But unfortunately, it's a way of actually inserting a remote JavaScript into your website, and that's when you start to get some trouble. Or you could do something malicious like just add a logout window document.location. So every time they view the comment, it logs them out. It's funny, but for a minute, but then it all ends in tears. So you never allow full HTML. If you're running your own code, Drupal does have some great functions built into it which allow you to wrap any input to make it safe. Filter XSS is a great example. In that one you can actually embed the HTML markup that you want to allow. So if you're building your own functions, you can actually make it quite safe and sane. And rule of thumb, never trust user input. I've seen trusted users cut and paste things that people have sent them saying, can you put this on the website, and completely trash the site without realizing it. So never trust user input. Always assume the worst and try and keep it as plain as you can. I thought I'd talk about permissions because I realized that, and for some of you this may be very straightforward, but we often talk about how we lock down the file system on the website. And things like chmod and chown are very common commands we often use in Linux, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to actually explain exactly what they are. Is everyone familiar with chmod? I think. Okay. Well, break down what it does. Those three numbers, these magic numbers you see listed, if you read in the install file, it often tells you that you need to chmod the file to this permission settings. Well, basically the numbers actually are broken down by the scope of how you want to lock it down. So the first number is actually broken down as the owner of the file. So if you edit a file or you upload Drupal, the owner of the file is you. The number that's first issued indicates your level of access or permission to that file. The second one is members of the same group. You may set up a webmaster group that you want to be able to edit files. So you may end up having it, so if you're a member of a certain group, you have right permission to it as well. The scary one is others, or often referred to as world. This is the rest of the world. And a lot of times if you set your directories as being writable by that subset, it means anyone in Apache can write to your file server if they find an exploit. And it may not just be through Drupal, it could be an exploit in another application on your site, or it could be a bug inside Apache. So when you make a directory world writable, you're giving people the ability or the opportunity to potentially write something to your file system. Now chown is just as much as the top one sets the permissions. Chown is change owner. You can often change the ownership of parts of your website. And one of the things I normally do is that when you install Drupal, I often change the ownership of the settings PHP file to the web server. And the web server is usually Well, it's slightly different in each different variant. Most Debian and Ubuntu servers, it's owned by an account called www-data. So I usually make that owned by the web server, but it means the users can't screw with it. If I get a user logs into the system, he can't make changes to that file. I only want my web server to be able to read that file. So once I've changed the ownership, I can use chmod, and I can say the owner of the file can read it, everybody else can't do anything with it. So that way it protects your settings PHP. The rest of the directory, I'll own it by, in this case, Andy. So I can go and FTP files up, I can make changes, I can do whatever I need, but there's no chance I can accidentally go in and mess with my settings PHP file. Yeah, I actually go in and change the setting on it. Well, actually, what I normally do, because I use a development environment, I'll make the change locally, and then I may change the permission, upload it, and change it back. I know it's an extra step, but it's always pays to be paranoid. So, yes.
So if you change the owner to the server, you don't own it anymore?
No, the server, basically, if you set it to that the owner is owned by the web server, it means Apache can read it. Apache needs to read it to be able to execute or be able to make a connection to your database. And so, you have to make an effort to change it. You have to change it back so that you can write to it, make the change, and then lock it back down again.
There are some Apache pre-ports where it executes as a user.
Yeah.
Apache 1.3 had it built in. Apache 2.0, you have to have a mod called ITK that keeps all files. It executes the Apache process as a user, so all your files will stay as your username, and no other user can see them.
Yeah, and that's really secure, but it potentially, I've read in some cases that can cause a performance hit.
I haven't seen a performance hit yet.
There you go. So. Yeah, I think that might be, yeah. But see, that's what I love about this session. There's always other people who know bits about this, and I always walk away learning something new. But it's very basic. It's very. We run across this all the time. I thought it'd be just interesting to give you a bit of a run through on it.
If you want to use like FTP, you have to pull down, a directory or something. The site's off where your settings PHP is located. Is it going to download the settings.php?
So I'm sorry, I missed that.
If you've changed it to ownership by the server.
Yes, well, if you've got it so that nobody else can read it, then no, you can actually lock it to the point where they can't read it. If you,
I'm worried about locking myself out. If I can I download it?
well, if you can get into the server with an account with it has enough permissions to run change, you can change the ownership back to you. And if you,
I'll have to go in through the shell.
yeah. Or some clients, some web hosting companies, if they give you a file management tool, there's often an option on there that once you're logged in on the master account, you can change permissions on the files. It's an extra step, but I think it's worth taking. Social engineering. Does anyone know who Kevin Mitnick is? Well, a couple of people. Can anybody tell me the quote he said in court when he was busted by Shimomura? Does anyone know that? Your kung fu is really good. He was basically FBI's number. He was on the top, he was on the top wanted list for years. Kevin Mitnick's an amazing programming hacker, but what he was exceptionally good at was social engineering. He could convince people to give him access to systems. He would dress up as a security guard and just walk into a company and walk into their server rooms.
Social engineering is the best hack.
He did, yeah. He also wrote some really good books on social engineering. He's recently out of prison and has a security firm, which is mitnicksecurity.com. But his life story is quite amazing. He, at one point, tried to get a job with the FBI, and as part of his application, he basically just downloaded names and addresses of people on the Witness Protection Program. And he sent a snapshot of that to the FBI as part of his job application. And when they tried to arrest him, he was saying, "I don't understand why they were so annoyed. I could have just given them all of them." So. But needless to say, they didn't give him a job, and he became the most wanted man in America for a while. But yeah, he's a very interesting guy, and he's written some great white papers and articles on social engineering. I've run into this in situations where, as a consultancy, not necessarily MediaCurrent, many years ago at another company, you often get involved with another company's website, so you often have to call a hosting provider if there's a problem. And the person who built the site is no longer there, the administrator doesn't work there anymore. There's just no, and the people who work at that company have got no historical information as to, we don't know who, it was Bill who set this up and he left 3 years ago. So I've run hosting firms before, and they're a lot better now than they used to be. And said, I work for this company and I do this, and I can provide information on the account, but not necessarily things like a contract number or who the main account exec was. And I've had them give me access to the website and actually get access to the server as well. And nowadays that's very hard to do. Most, I'm not saying I do that, but I'm saying that a couple of years ago that was very common. And a lot of the times if you're dealing with companies where people are very non-technical, they'll have that post-it note with all the FTP and the SSH information, and you ring in and you speak with authority and say, I'm the new consultant working on this and I need this now. And I go, there you go. And they just give you everything. And then you walk away and they give you everything. And so social engineering is something to watch out for as well. And that's something you can't code, but you can educate people. Always assume that people are, going back to that rule, never trust who uses. Couple of little one-offs. I actually wanted to try and do a bit of a demo with some of the stuff, but there was a couple of things I thought were kind of fun that I thought I'd like to share. The default files directory in Drupal and also the temp partition are usually marked as world writable. So that you can basically, when you upload a file, Drupal will store it underneath its site's default files directory. The temp folder, or temp if you have it on a separate partition, that usually is world writable, and any account on the box can write to those particular partitions. If you're any kind of Linux user, you'll know these directories. You'll know that if it's a Drupal site, it has a files folder somewhere, but temp is always the same path, and it's always got the same permissions. If you set them on their own partition, you can actually tell the Linux file system to actually make them what we call no suid, no exec. And it basically means that you cannot execute any file that's on this partition. And the way this is lovely is I was pulled in one time to actually look at a security breach, and it was actually happening while we were in there looking at the box. And we watched this guy dropping these files into the temp folder, and we'd actually locked the temp folder not to execute. So he would drop the file down and try and run it, and it would just not run. It just wouldn't execute. It's the Windows equivalent of having an exe that doesn't do anything if it's in a certain place on your file system. So if you lock down the temp folder and you lock down the site's default files and inside the fs tab file so that there's no exec, no suid, can't run it, can't do anything with it. So even if someone does breach your defenses and drop a file on your server, who cares? Can't do anything with it. That's really, it's in the etc folder. There's a file called fs tab which defines how your file systems are mounted. Your best bet is to get your system administrator to do that. And usually if you're building your own server, that's one of your design decisions of how you're actually going to put the partition table together. The one thing you've got to watch out for really is the temp folder. Some distributions of Linux, they download updates to the temp folder and then execute them. So you may want to look at the different flavors of Linux you're running to make sure that yours isn't one of them. CentOS and Red Hat, SUSE, they don't. So if you do that on any of those, it works fine. So, some Debian flavors, I think Ubuntu server doesn't do it anymore, but it used to. It downloads and executes from the temp folder. So if you do that, you can't do system updates because it will download them and they can't run them. But it's a really good thing to do. This is my favorite little trick, and it's just so much fun. wget-rc. We all kick off cron by writing a cron tab entry to pull cron.php on our website. The problem is wget is normally used to get a file from a remote location and store it locally. Before Drush came along, I used to use wget to install modules. I just shell in, get the file and download it. If you go into the etc folder, there's usually a file called wget-rc, which is a universal config file for wget. If you set it to delete after equals on, it will immediately delete the file when it's downloaded. Again, this is like watching bugs hit a windshield. I was watching somebody trying to download a rootkit to a server and then execute it, And the moment he did it, it was like file not found, because wget was deleting it the moment it actually downloaded it automatically. But he tried about 4 or 5 times before he realized that it was not going to work. Bless their heart, they try. So, but it's a very simple thing, and we all use wget for running cron.php. So, sorry? No, you can't. But I think security is always a fine balance between how far you want to lock it down and how usable you want to make the machine. So it's going to be a judgment call at that point. Do I want it locked down to the point where I can't do anything, or do I want to have it to the point where it's a very secure site? If your company does website security, lock it down. If you get hacked, company's over. It's done. Run security scans against your code, and I've actually got 2 security tools which are both open source actually on the laptop, and if we get a few minutes I'll give you a quick demo. OpenVAS is one I like, and the other one is RATS. I was introduced to RATS recently. It's a command line tool. It is Linux based, but if you're a Windows or Mac user, you can actually get an Ubuntu image from VMware. And what I'll do is I'll update the slides with some instructions on how to run a little Linux install on your own machine. But RATS is amazing. It'll go through your source code and it'll highlight every security error it can find and dump it out in a list, so you can actually go and fix them. OpenVAS is very good as well, and I can show you a little bit how that works. Limit who has access to your code base and server. How many times have people given root access to vendors? I've gone into sites where I find really scary looking directories that shouldn't be inside a Drupal site. And I found out it's because, we had this company who was doing a bit of work on Drupal. And you realize that they didn't really need root access to the box. They didn't even need access, you could give them access to your file server running a Subversion account and let them look at the source code, so that and then you as an owner of the site can then commit it back once you know it's clean, but never hand out root access. And as much as a lot of you say, well, that's really straightforward and obvious, it's not. There's so many sites where people have left the company and they've not changed passwords, or they've let vendors in and given them full control on the server. Yeah. Actually, I totally agree with you. But I got into a very heated discussion with somebody on that, and they did pose a very interesting argument. If you have SVN running on your website root, in Apache you can block access to the SVN folders and anything below it. But the advantage is that if somebody does change anything, you've got a record of what the file base was before and what it is afterwards. But at the end of the day, you could just not take that approach where you don't have Subversion in there. Yeah. I mean, you block those out, but it's amazing. One of the best hacking tools out there is Google. Google error messages, and you will find if you find there's a common error message to an Apache intrusion, Google will scan it as part of its daily spider crawl. So a lot of the times you can actually use those error codes to actually find sites that are vulnerable to those attacks. And SVN's a great example. But the other one I was looking at, instead of doing it now, is I take the approach where if you're doing an export to publish your website, you could potentially pull out a previous release from Subversion and just do a diff against the directory to identify what's been changed. But yeah, it's a very good point. Code for what you expect. I said earlier, don't try and guess what a hacker's going to do to break into your site. If you know what you're expecting back, that's what you code for. Otherwise, you're continually playing a running battle, trying to find out what they're going to do to break in and try and get around it. Web application firewalls. These are a fairly recent thing, and I've run into a couple, and I'm going to give you a list of a couple here, both commercial and open source as well. Web application firewalls are really quite cool. What they do is they sit in between your workflow. So if you post your site to a staging server where you're working on your code, the web application firewall sits and looks at that code. It basically scans the code line by line against a massive database, and it basically identifies any security issues it finds in your code. So the result is, before you push something to your live web server, the web application firewall will basically interrupt it. And you can automate it on some systems so that code cannot be pushed to your production environment if there's any security issues with it. Now, there's a couple out there which are worth looking at. The first one, Naxi, is actually open source. It runs on Nginx. Unfortunately, I can't talk authoritatively. I've not really used it. The one I did highlight was White Hat Security. I've used that on 2 different companies now, and it's amazing. It produces basically a report on every single piece of code, every vulnerability, and it breaks them down by different levels of severity as well. So it became one of those jobs you did as a sysadmin, that you would go in and spend 5 minutes just seeing any code that someone committed, or get an email from the software to say that new bugs have been discovered. But there's quite a few out there on the market, but White Hat Security is very good, and they're also very Drupal friendly. They've done a couple of presentations recently around Drupal. But Naxi is one that I was going to spend some time and take a look at, because it's open source and it got some great reviews. It's very good. Some open source tools, as well as OpenVAS, which we'll take a look at, and RAT. Tripwire is quite an interesting one. It's a very old school tool. It's basically when you build a server, when you run Tripwire, it creates a database of all the files and the permissions, and basically it creates a snapshot of your server. It's basically used that if you do get intrusion, you've got something to compare it against. So you can try and figure out what's changed on the box once somebody's gone in. It's a couple of commercial applications. When you look at White Hat, Barracuda, and Perva, they're web application firewalls. Web Inspect is a very interesting product. Does anyone use Web Inspect? Does anyone know Web Inspect? They're actually from Atlanta. Have you met the CEO from there, Caleb? He was 19 when he started that company. It's an amazing company. Web Inspect, as I said, they're a local firm. They recently got bought out by HP. They write a web security scanning tool that specifically looks for vulnerabilities in websites, and it is very, very good. Most of the cybersecurity teams I've worked with in the past, that's one of the main tools that they use for checking for, if you're doing an audit on a website, Web Inspect is very good. The only downside, I'll say, is since they've been bought by HP, you'll have a hard time getting a salesman on the phone. They just never seem to answer their phone, but it's a brilliant product if you can get them on the phone. Command line warriors, when you're actually trying to figure out what people have done, there are so many tools out there, but 3 old favorites: Find, grep, and LSOF. LSOF is one that is probably new for a lot of people. It shows you open files by a user or a process. You can use it to identify live traffic running on your website. If you look at any kind of stat programs, you tend to be that a file's being used, but you don't know who by or what service. Using LSOF, you can actually tell it to interactively show you who's using the file system from the web server. It shows you all the files that are running. So that's a good one. Tiger teams. Again, good picture at 3 in the morning. Not so much in the light of day. It's better to be ready than get ready. You are at some point going to run into an issue. Better to be prepared for it. Tiger teams is a term that came out from the aeronautical spacecrafts, early days of NASA. Completely lost the Paris Peaks today. And it's basically a team of people within the company who represent different parts of your organization, who get pulled in whenever there's a security incursion. And basically, some of the people on that team might be a bit of a surprise to you. Your IT department, whoever maintains your servers, that's a given. Whoever maintains the boxes. Website technical lead or project manager, you need to have your WebE in there. Management stakeholders. A lot of the times, the people who cause the most slowdowns in trying to investigate a problem is management. They're always in there going, our site's down, it's costing us money, what's going on? And you want to say, well, if you let us get in there to look at it and get sorted, we can probably get you an answer back. So it's good to identify a management stakeholder who becomes the frontline communication for the rest of the team, so that you can provide him first-hand updates, and then he can disseminate information to the rest of the company. Marketing and corporate communications needs to be on the team as well. Corporate communication managers should have a plan in place on how to tell the rest of the world that we've been hacked. A press release, even having an email ready to go if you potentially have to send it to clients and say, I'm sorry, but your data has been compromised. So having somebody from your corporate communication team is a must. Also, if anyone rings from the press, it's best to send them to a marketer or a press release manager who knows what he's talking about and is part of the team and can say the right things. And legal, obviously. get it, it's legal will get involved. So have a contact in legal on the team as well. Interesting note, Microsoft refers to Tiger teams as core computer security incident response teams. That's a bit of a mouthful. So I call them Tiger teams, which is the common term. There's a lot of things they can do, and we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'm going to go through these, and the slides will be made available. Your Tiger team does quite a lot. You want to make sure beforehand that you've got all your communication access points and that the team knows them. They know the phone numbers out of hours of the abuse department at your service provider. They have the home numbers for all the major members of the executive team so that they can call them at 3 in the morning and say, I hate to say this, but I think our website's been hacked. You should have all your documentation available to the entire team, and it's usually private. So you set up a private section of your intranet or in SharePoint and just put all those team members will have instant access at any time, day or night, to all the contact points and all the communication plans and all the things you need to manage an incursion. You need to identify a chain of command so that if something does happen, you know who's called first. Think of it as an escalation procedure for IT. If they're not available straight away, because it could happen at 3 in the morning on a Saturday, then you need to know who those numbers are. You need to respond as fast as possible. Flag all emails with either a response code relating to the issue or create an email address specifically for the team. Can anyone think why you might do that? No? I learned this through horrible experience. It means that if it ever goes to legal, then your IT department can find every email, every document relating to the subject at hand and collate that for your legal department to hand over to the authorities. So if you use an email address like tiger@mycompany or security@mycompany, your IT department can basically pull every email that was sent to with that as a recipient and use that as part of the legal process. If you use a code, then that could go into a Word doc or a spreadsheet, and then in SharePoint you can collate all those documents and put them together, and they can also be packaged to hand over to legal. But there's nothing worse than trying to find all that information after the event. Educate your employees. You can have this amazing plan in place that just does everything you want, and somebody rings up a disgruntled employee in the mailroom, and he does not know what's going on, but he knows that the site's been completely hacked and we're all going to die. It's all going to burst into flames. That's not the one you want speaking to the press. So you need to educate your staff. Anything happens, send them to the corporate communication manager or your marketing manager, whoever is your first line of communication to the rest of the world. Educate your staff. Have a point man. In the past, it's usually the director of IT, but have someone who is going to be the one person the execs can go to if they have any questions on the entire process for how are you doing, what's the status of play, because it's an unfortunate side effect that a lot of times these intrusions can cause slowdowns. The first time I dealt with a severe attack, it took almost a week before we really had all that information in place, because everybody was running around and trying to take control and trying to contact authorities and try to deal with it, and they ended up causing more harm than good. So it's really worth having a point man. Always have a plan. And I love that quote, and whether it's relevant or not, I don't care, so I'll put it in anyway. Because always have a plan. Have a corporate communication plan. Have an incident response worksheet. Have a prepared press release. Internal communication policy. Make sure that your internal staff know what to say and who to send people to if they get contacted. Appointing a single point of contact for inquiries. Make sure that every member on the team has all the contact details for all the other members of the team. It's a simple thing, but at 3 in the morning when you're trying to get hold of your IT director, it's kind of scary. So make sure that everybody has everything they need. And have a secure place to put all the evidence. When you actually start to collate data, you need a place that the entire team can get to and have just limited access to, but everything is in one place. So, in a summary, sanitize your input, use Drupal methods, keep your site up to date, have a plan, audit your code, and never hack core. And as Dries has been quoted, well, he didn't add the secret lab bit, I added that. But, yeah. What to do when you get a breach? That's pretty much the look everyone has on their face when it first happens, after the panic has subsided a bit. So the next thing is, and then the next bit, after you've not panicked, is get your Tiger team on it. At this point, you should have a plan, a workflow. You have your communication already sorted out. You've got the contact points for all of the authorities you need to contact, and you can get going. So you activate your CSIR, whatever Microsoft calls it, Tiger team. First thing I always do is start the clock. If you make money on your website, every hour your website's down is money lost through potential profit. That's money lost. So it can attach it can put in perspective the scale of the damage. Rather than saying we were down for 3 hours, if your company makes $5,000 an hour, if you turn around and say, well, we lost 10 grand in business because our website was down for this amount of time, it really can put things in perspective. So start the clock. And also when you're doing with the authorities, they'll want to know to the minute what everybody did and when it all happened. So you log everything into whatever your communication tool is, whether it's SharePoint or an email chain, a Word doc, or even a Drupal site you put aside for it, but log everything. Pull the plug, don't shut the box down. Any ideas why you do that? Thank you, yeah. Servers, when they run through run levels, they run through stages. When they boot up and they boot down, the payload could clean itself up. So if you shut the server down, it might delete itself, or it might delete evidence of the actual incursion. I put the power plug on the server. Yeah, I pull it. I do a hard stop, or do that old trick of hold the power in button for about 5-6 seconds. That's a hard stop. That kills the machine. Depending, and as I said earlier, it's always a bit of a fine tuning between how secure you want the box and how usable your site's going to be. But usually, if it's anything that's quite high in scope that you're going to pull the authorities into, I pull the plug. I never work on the server when it's live. I'll attach that hard drive to a remote machine and look at it in read-only mode so that no data gets corrupted. So that's the other one. If possible, take a copy of the disk and store it offline. Never log into the server if you can. Mount it remotely if possible. Get the authorities involved. Sorry. Sorry? No, well, as I said, at that point, the problem you get is that when you get this kind of knee-jerk reaction, every IT guy does. Server's been hacked, they start to get in there and they trample all over the forensic data. The moment you start editing stuff, you start changing file creation dates or file access dates, and that's data that the authority is going to need. So that's why you pull it straight away. Don't try and edit the thing yourself, because 9 times out of 10, you end up destroying the data with all the best intentions. Don't use a backup without knowing the cause of the attack. I've seen this one twice, where the way the IT department handled it is they changed the password in Drupal and just put the site back out there again, turn it back on again. And they were really surprised when the same thing happened an hour later. So if you don't know the cause of it, don't trust it. So yeah, don't use a backup. Don't change passwords or try and fix things, because you start to change file creation, file access times. If you're trying to do any kind of serious forensic data on it, you end up destroying what you're trying to protect. If the file system was compromised, I never trust the box again. I always rebuild from scratch. And always investigate in parallel to the authorities. We're going to talk very quickly about the Secret Service. They can be a bit slow to get back to you. So sometimes you want to do your own kind of forensic investigation. But again, you want to make sure that you don't actually overwrite anything that the authorities are doing. Interesting thing about the law in the States is that you're required to tell your users that their data has been compromised straight away unless it interferes with the investigation. And in which case, it's the authorities will then tell your corporate communication people when you need to actually tell your users. So in one company, it was 2 weeks. So that gave the company time to get themselves up and running, but the authorities said you can't tell people yet until we identify the cause of the issue. A lot of federal data on that one. We'll look at some tools very quickly. We've only got a few minutes left, and I actually want to show you 2 tools which are very cool. A couple of resources. Slides are available at bit.ly/DCA-security. Security team, most of the websites on Drupal.org, which are very good. There's a really great article on Microsoft TechNet on CCSIRTs, Tiger teams. It breaks down the roles and members of the team, what kind of documents they need to have, and what kind of workflow you need to put in place. Secret Service has an office here in Atlanta. They have a cyber crimes task force. They're really good. Now, being English, and as a kid, that's like a sheriff's badge in England. We don't have these kind of badges. When you deal with the Secret Service, they put those badges in their signatures. It's kind of a little kid thing going. But they're actually based here in Atlanta, and pretty much every city's got a task force. You need to have their contact numbers. You need to have all of these as part of your communication plan. And these questions, and I'll do a very quick demo if you've got time.
This is a much lower level, and I started using session-inspired module, just because I've got about 45 in-house users, like just leave their session on and go home.
Yeah.
And it, kicks them off. So are there other Drupal modules?
You can actually do that inside. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The question was basically there's a module that allows you to kick off users where their session's gone on too long. And is there any other modules you could do? Drupal core does it. You can actually go into your settings. No, not settings PHP. I think it's in HD access, and you can actually set the timeout value for sessions. And then when cron runs, it does it as part of the PHP garbage update. So you can actually run it in core. I don't know. I can find out for you though. If you've got any questions you can't answer with, then I'll make a note of it and send you an email afterwards. But yeah. Any other questions? Do you want a very quick demo of some scary software? Very, very quick. All right. Talked very quickly about two tools. One was called RATS, and one's called OpenVAS. OpenVAS is open source, and it basically has, you want to see that? It runs as a server and a client. Now, even though I'm running Linux, the server runs on any Linux server. There are clients out there for pretty much every operating system. So there's a client for Mac and Windows and so on. I'm using Ubuntu, so you can actually see that it automatically checks for a lot of very common issues with Drupal. It also allows you to do server checks and against Apache and different flavors of Linux as well. Even if you're running Drupal on Windows, it'll even do Windows checks too. You can schedule your runs. It produces a very detailed report. It'll actually go in and say, here's all the different issues I found. You can use these as a hit list, which I find really useful. For instance, there's an interesting one here. You get a lot of false positives in these software. It tells me there's an email server running on the box. Well, of course I know there is an email server, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a hack or there's a vulnerability. So I can actually go in and flag that and say, well, as much as there's an email server on there, it's actually a false positive. I don't need to know about that in future. So any future scans will then completely ignore that. Once you set your website up, you can actually run standard tests on a regular basis. And it's a great way of getting your code and running it through and just actually making sure that you can see what's going on.
So how many modules that you use fields, things that pretty much every Drupal handles, every Drupal install, pretty much every Drupal install has? Do they pass that test?
No. Drupal core does. Yeah, and I'll tell you another one actually. Is I'm going to show you another one very quickly, and then I'll be done.
Before you install it, that's maybe a good reason to just tell somebody no, we're not going to install the modules. Pass that test.
Yes. Actually, as a sysadmin, if security is very important, that's something you should be doing. But again, I don't know many sites that do
Well, we
that.
have people that just install the modules on the site. And like,
Yeah.
they have access, we don't know, they just do the easy thing, they just install them. They're marketing people, and it's like,
I have a love-hate relationship with marketing departments.
sales, marketing.
Yeah. Well, here's the other one. RATS is another one. It's a command line tool. It looks for PHP vulnerabilities. If I run it against Drupal 6, it comes back clean, which is no fun. So I actually downloaded vTiger, which is an open source CRM package. When you go into the directory on the server and then just run RATS, it scans every single file through the source code, and it will tell you every vulnerability it finds. And I've run this against a number of modules in Drupal, and it's scary, some of the things in there. And some of the issues you'll actually see on it, I'll actually pull it up. It will actually list the vulnerabilities. It will tell you the scale of how worried you should be about it. And a lot of times if there's a fix or there's an article, it'll often give you a link to a security article, and here's how this got flagged, and here's what you can do to fix it. With OpenVAS as well, if it comes up and it finds a security issue, it always lists the database entry explaining the problem, and it always provides a fix as well. So there's no excuse for going in there and not cleaning the code up. But Rats is really good as a very quick command line tool. You can scan any Drupal site, any module, any PHP file, and it'll tell you exactly if it's secure or not. So that's it. And it's a Linux command. So if you need to run it on a Windows or a Mac, you'd have to install something like VMware and run like an Ubuntu desktop or whatever. Some servers will have it installed, or you can install it on any Linux box. So you can usually install it on the server that you actually work on.
I think they're integrated to the one.
Sorry?
More level, involve people, like if they're installing a mod,
To do a test.
a warning or something, to where, this is not good.
Yeah, that's cool.